Hello YouTube. For the final video in this series, I think this will probably be the final video, though I suppose I might come back to it later, but I think this is probably going to be the last one. So for this video, I'd like to examine a position developed by Arthur Fine called the natural ontological attitude, or the acronym there is pronounced NOAA. So this is a kind of non-philosophical or agnostic position. It's designed to be a third way, a compromise position between realism and the kinds of anti-realism we've seen so far. Fine presents this view in his book The Shaky Game, Einstein, Realism and the Quantum Theory, which is a really great book, as well as the philosophy of science. There's a lot of really interesting stuff on the history of quantum physics, so I recommend that book, and this is Arthur Fine, of course. So, as I said, Fine thinks of the natural ontological attitude as a third way between realism and anti-realism. Now, just to note a point of definition, very often the term anti-realism is simply used as an umbrella term to refer to any position that isn't realism. That's the way I use it. So, on this definition, if you're not a realist, you're an anti-realist. On this definition, the very idea of a third way between realism and anti-realism is incoherent. But of course, we can define anti-realism more narrowly, and Fine adopts a narrower definition. Fine's definition of anti-realism will become clear later. First of all, we need to consider how Fine conceives of the debate between realists and anti-realists, because he has a somewhat unusual conception of the realist-anti-realist debate. The first point to note, according to Fine, is that both realists and anti-realists accept, in some sense, the results of science. Both realists and anti-realists are happy to use scientific theories. Let's say we're standing next to a cloud chamber and we see a white streak appear, and I ask, hey, what was that? What happened there? Well, whether you're a realist or an anti-realist, your response will be something like, when a charged particle passes through the cloud chamber, it ionizes the molecules in its path, which makes them electrically charged. These molecules then attract more molecules, which in turn attract more molecules, so eventually what happens is that enough vapour condenses to leave a visible trail. You'll give an explanation something like that, whether you're a realist or an anti-realist. So what the realist and the anti-realist have in common is a commitment to using scientific theories and scientific results in appropriate contexts in their lives. So in some very broad sense then, they both think that scientific theories are true. Now, on Fine's analysis, the difference between realists and anti-realists lies in their adoption of different theories of truth. Now, I think this is quite a strange way to present the realist-anti-realist debate, but you'll have to bear with me because it's important to understanding Fine's position. According to Fine, when realists consider the nature of scientific knowledge, they add a correspondence theory of truth. So I should say there are many theories of truth available in philosophy. If you're interested in the topic of truth, the book Theories of Truth by Richard Kirkham is a good introduction. But the most popular theory of truth, certainly the common sense theory of truth, is the correspondence theory. This is the claim that truth is a matter of correspondence to the world. So consider the statement, snow is white. This statement is true. And according to the correspondence theory, it's true because it corresponds to the world. Because there is in the world this substance called snow, and snow has the property of whiteness. There are various different ways of making this theory more precise. There are different versions of it, but you should grasp how that works. It's pretty simple. Propositions are true just in case they correspond to the facts. This is the theory of truth that realists adopt. The realist says that scientific theories are true, and she means that scientific theories correspond to the way the world is. The realist says that it's true that a charged particle has passed through the cloud chamber, and by this she means that there is in the world a charged particle and a cloud chamber, and the particle passed through the cloud chamber. That actually happened in the world. Charged particles and cloud chambers are part of the furniture of the world. Again, that's pretty commonsensical. However, there are other theories of truth available. So I'll mention a couple of the more famous. First, there's the coherence theory. This begins with the insight that we all want our system of beliefs to be coherent, and we're more likely to be sceptical of a claim the more it conflicts with our other beliefs. So I'll use an example from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Suppose a drunk comes to you and says there are pink elephants dancing on the highway in front of us. When we consider whether or not to believe this, we think about our other beliefs. So we will consider, for instance, the fact that we believe that elephants are grey, not pink. We believe that this location is not inhabited by elephants. We believe that there's neither a zoo or a circus nearby. And we believe that severely intoxicated persons are known to experience hallucinations, and so on. The drunk's claim of dancing pink elephants is inconsistent with many of our other beliefs, so we reject it. On the other hand, the supposition that he's just hallucinating is perfectly consistent with our other beliefs, so that seems more acceptable. And notice, of course, that the same procedure is at work in the sciences. When we test a hypothesis, we perform various experiments, and these experiments will generate various beliefs for us to test the hypothesis against. If the hypothesis is consistent with those beliefs, we accept it. If it's inconsistent with them, we modify it. So the basic slogan of the coherence theory is that a belief is true just in case it is part of a coherent system of beliefs. What's important to note about this is that on this view, truth doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the external world or anything like that. Truth is just a matter of having a coherent system. A belief is true just as long as it's part of a coherent system of beliefs. Somebody who accepts the coherence theory would therefore not be a realist. We can say that our best scientific theories are true, but all this means is that our best scientific theories provide the most coherent system of beliefs. Another option is the pragmatist theory of truth. To put this in a slogan, this is the idea that truth is whatever is useful to believe. Now, what counts as useful? Well, there are many different things we could say here, and there are many different versions of this theory. You can look it up if you're interested. But at least with respect to science, usefulness or utility will probably include, for instance, accurate predictions or explanatory power or fruitful technological applications. So a scientific theory is true if it makes accurate predictions, if it provides a single explanation for various phenomena, if it can be applied in research and technology and so on. As with the coherence theory, there's no claim here about correspondence with the world. Quantum physics makes extremely accurate predictions, which means it's useful, so it's true. Again, this is clearly a view of truth that is compatible with anti-realism. If saying that electrons exist just amounts to the claim that theories of electrons make the right predictions or have explanatory power or whatever, no anti-realist would object to that. Now, so Fine thinks that we can understand realism and anti-realism in terms of the theory of truth that they adopt. We all think that science delivers truth, but we understand truth in very different ways. Now, there are many arguments for realism, but Fine thinks that the real motivation for realism is much more mundane. He calls it the homely argument. And this is the simple point that we trust the evidence of our senses. So when we go about in the world, we trust that our perceptions are basically accurate. Furthermore, we have a similar trust in the results of science. If a scientist says that there are electrons, then we will also be inclined to assert that there are electrons. And if somebody comes along and says that electrons are just fictions, well, we don't seem to have any more reason to accept this than to accept the idea that everyday objects like trees and rivers and so on are fictions. So the homely line is that I trust the evidence of my senses, and in the same way I have confidence in the results of science, so we should be realists. But notice that this position, even if it's convincing, doesn't establish realism, because this position says absolutely nothing about the nature of truth. Realists would accept this homely position, but then they would add a correspondence theory of truth. They would say that the truth of scientific theories amounts to corresponding to the way the world is. But anti-realists would also accept this position. Anti-realists are not anti-science. They're perfectly happy to utilise science. So in some sense they would say that scientific theories are true, but they would just add a theory of truth that doesn't entail correspondence with the world. Ultimately then, Fine thinks that both realists and anti-realists can accept this core position, which says that scientific theories are true and scientific theories are on a par with more homely beliefs, with more everyday beliefs. The natural ontological attitude advises us to just stick with this core position and then add nothing to it. The natural ontological attitude accepts the results of science, just as we accept the results of everyday perceptions, and then it advises agnosticism about the more abstract metaphysical issues. So what about the theory of truth then? What does Noah say about truth? Well, an option that's becoming quite popular in philosophy is the deflationary theory of truth. Basically, this is the claim that truth is not a substantial property. Truth is certainly an important predicate in our language, but the deflationary theory claims that it doesn't have any metaphysical significance. The simplest version of this theory asserts what's known as the equivalence thesis, which says that P is true has the same meaning as just P. When we assert a sentence is true, we're doing nothing more than asserting the sentence itself. When I say the sentence "snow is white" is true, this just means snow is white. That's it. There's nothing more to it. By definition, we know that the following biconditional holds about truth. Any theory of truth must accept the biconditional P is true if and only if P. This is just a statement about how the truth predicate works in our language. So any theory of truth must entail this biconditional, because it's just a definitional matter of how the word works. If the sentence "snow is white" is true, then snow is white. Conversely, if snow is white, then the sentence "snow is white" is true. So that's pretty simple. I hope that's just this biconditional is a simple definitional point about how the word truth works. So the deflationary theory of truth just claims that this biconditional is all there is to say about truth. The concept of truth is simply a convenient device. It allows us to, for instance, say things like "everything in that book is true" or "most of what she said was true." When we agree with the speaker, rather than laboriously repeating her claims, we can just say, "Oh yeah, what she said was true." So it's easy to see why languages have a concept of truth, but there's nothing metaphysically important about it. Saying that a certain statement is true is you're just asserting that statement. Or when I say that everything that woman said is true, I'm essentially just reasserting everything she said. So that's the deflationary theory. Now, Noah accepts nothing more than this basic deflationary concept of truth. To say that it's true that there are electrons is just to say that there are electrons. Truth is not to be defined as correspondence or coherence or pragmatic utility or whatever. This is the core position. We accept the results of our best science as true, just as we accept the results of perception as true, and we stop there. We abstain from giving any analysis of truth beyond the basic definitional claim that P is true if and only if P. Now, there are two major objections to Fine's project. Fine claims to have found a core position that both realists and anti-realists accept, and he claims that by accepting this core position alone, we will have a view that is in between realism and anti-realism. One objection is that actually anti-realists do not accept this core position. A second objection is that the core position alone entails realism. So let's consider the first objection, that anti-realists do not accept the core position. As we saw, Fine conceives of the realist-anti-realist debate in terms of the nature of truth. We can understand anti-realists not as denying that scientific theories are true, but as offering a different analysis of what truth is. This might be a coherence theory of truth, or a pragmatic theory of truth, or something else. For the logical positivists, to say that a theory is true is just to say that it is empirically verifiable. For Bas van Frassen and the constructive empiricists, to say that a theory is true is to say that it is empirically adequate, where recall that empirical adequacy just means that the theory is correct about observable phenomena. All anti-realists deny that scientific theories are true in the sense of the correspondence theory. They deny that scientific theories correspond to the way the world is, but on other theories of truth, anti-realists would be happy to accept scientific theories as true. Van Frassen denies that scientific theories are true because he assumes a correspondence theory of truth. If we adopt a different theory of truth, he would no longer deny that they are true. So that's fair enough. But there remains a serious problem here, which is pointed out by Alan Musgrave. This is that Fine's core position requires us to treat observables and unobservables as on a par. This is one of the basic claims of the core position, is we think that the results of science are true, and we also think that, in the same way that we think that everyday perceptions are true. But it seems pretty clear that anti-realists explicitly reject this. If we understand anti-realism as offering a different theory of truth, we must bear in mind that this theory of truth is only applied to statements about observables. It's only applied to statements about unobservables. Statements about observables, on the other hand, are true in the standard sense. So Van Frassen says that statements about unobservables are true just in case they are empirically adequate. But then he would say that statements about observables are true in the usual way. They're true in that they correspond to the world. Really, the whole point of anti-realism is that the findings of science are on shakier epistemic ground than the deliverances of immediate perception. Unobservables are on shakier ground than observables. So even if we treat the realism anti-realism debate as being concerned with the nature of truth, it seems to me we can't say that anti-realists accept the core position, because the basic element of the core position is that unobservables and observables should be treated the same way. So there maybe is still a way to save Fine's argument. Perhaps what we can do is say, well, both realists and anti-realists accept unobservables. They accept electrons. This is just the point that we're both committed to using the theory and to explaining observable phenomena in terms of the theory. As I noted before, if we're confronted with certain phenomena in a cloud chamber, both the realist and the anti-realist will give the same explanation. Of course, the realist will claim to believe the explanation. She will claim that the explanation is true. The anti-realist will claim that the explanation is empirically adequate or whatever, but that's all. It's not worthy of belief, though we can still exploit it in the right circumstances. What we have here is shared acceptance. And similarly, there's a shared acceptance of observable phenomena. Perhaps this can define the core position. So rather than defining the core position in terms of accepting that claims about unobservables and observables are both true, perhaps we could say, well, look, we all accept claims about observables and we all accept claims about unobservables. Perhaps that can be the core position. We accept electrons in mitochondria and black holes, and we accept that there are trees in cars and fields, in the sense that we all appeal to these things in theories, we all use these theories in appropriate circumstances, and so on. There's no need to add anything more to that. But I think that the problem is that this concept of acceptance is just too broad. So consider Stannis Baratheon, a character from Game of Thrones and Song of Ice and Fire. In the sense that the anti-realist accepts electrons, we also accept Stannis Baratheon. We appeal to Stannis Baratheon in our explanations. So I might ask, for instance, well, why did Mance Rayder's attack on the wall fail? And to answer that question, we will presumably say something about Stannis Baratheon. Now this is all acceptance amounts to for the anti-realist. So if the core position is just this very weak kind of acceptance, that's clearly not compatible with realism. When the realist says that she accepts electrons, she means something much stronger than the sense in which we also accept fictions. And I think it's also clear that Fine's core position, the natural ontological attitude, also assumes a stronger sense of acceptance. I would imagine that Fine would say that he doesn't believe that Stannis Baratheon exists, but he does believe that electrons exist. So pretty clearly, the natural ontological attitude is not just about acceptance very broadly defined. So ultimately, I don't think it's true that anti-realists like Van Frassen and the logical positivists and so on can adopt the core position. I think the core position is inconsistent with instrumentalism and skepticism and constructive empiricism and all the many other kinds of anti-realisms. But it does seem true that realists could accept the core position, or at least that the core position is part of the realist view. However, this leads us to the second major objection, which is that the core position isn't really any different from realism. Noah collapses into realism. Again, this has been argued by Alan Musgrave in his article Noah's Ark, Fine for Realism. The thought is this. Noah says that scientific theories are true. It says that there are electrons, mitochondria, black holes, genes, plasmids, whatever. Furthermore, there are electrons in exactly the same sense as there are trees and flowers and cars and oceans. The question then is, well, is this really a substantial challenge to realism? I mean, the whole point of realism is that we should believe in unobservables just as we believe in observables. Now, Fine says, well, Noah doesn't accept the correspondence theory. But it's not really clear that most realists accept the correspondence theory either. Realism isn't actually a claim about the nature of truth. It's a claim about unobservables. Specifically, it claims that we should believe in those unobservables postulated by our best theories. Alan Musgrave, who is a realist, he does not accept the correspondence theory. So it seems arguable that Fine's whole way of conceiving the realism-anti-realism debate is just mistaken. And perhaps this natural ontological attitude is just no different from realism. Now, I think that this is a bit too hasty. I think that the natural ontological attitude's core position really does represent a serious challenge to the realist. But I think Fine was wrong in sort of arguing that this was about the nature of theories of truth. We can see that the challenge that Noah presents by considering perhaps slightly different form of anti-realism known as social constructivism. So the rest of this video is based on some arguments from Derek Turner's book, Making Prehistory. This is Derek Turner, this is the book. Making Prehistory is an analysis of the realism debate as it pertains to paleontology, and it is a really fantastic book. I highly recommend it if you can find it cheap. Really, really good. If you're interested in realism, and if you're interested in paleontology and biology and those historical sciences, you've got to get this book. It's brilliant. Anyway, the social constructivism. There are different ways to define social constructivism about science, but what we will say is that social constructivism about science is the view that the results of science are in some significant sense dependent on us. In other words, facts are constructed or made by scientists. They're not discovered by scientists. The social constructivist is happy to assert that there are electrons, that electrons exist, that it is true that there are electrons, and that this is true in the sense that theories about electrons correspond to the way the world is. The constructivist is happy to accept all of that, but the constructivist adds that electrons are mind dependent. They are constructed by scientists. So just to be clear, to say that X is mind dependent is to say something like if all minds were annihilated or if all minds were different, X would cease to exist or X would cease to be the case. By analogy, consider monetary value. This is clearly a social construction. Let's say I have a rare antique and get it valued. I'm told it's worth £1,000. It's obvious that the monetary value of this antique is dependent upon our valuations. If all humans disappeared tomorrow, it would no longer be worth anything. Or if we all decided to just stop caring about money, then it would no longer be worth anything. Social constructivism about science asserts something like X would not exist or X would not be the case if the scientific community thought differently. Now, this is a very bizarre view when we apply it to scientific claims. In the past, scientists did not propose electrons, and so at that time, electrons did not exist. Electrons came into existence once the scientific community had a consensus arrived at a consensus about them. Today, we quite literally occupy a different world than people in the past. We construct the world. Similarly, the social constructivist will say things like, the Holocaust would not have occurred if the community of historians did not now think it occurred. Dinosaurs would not have been warm-blooded if the scientific community did not now think that they were warm-blooded. Protons would not be composed of quarks if physicists adopted a different theory of fundamental particles, and so on. Constructivism also entails that many propositions are neither true nor false. If scientists have no consensus about a particular phenomenon X, then there is simply no fact of the matter one way or the other about X. To give Turner's example, there is no fact of the matter whether or not the dinosaur Pachycephalosaurus had a neon blue patch on its head. If the community of paleontologists gathers more evidence and comes to the consensus that Pachycephalosaurus had a neon blue patch on its head, then it will become a fact that it had a neon blue patch on its head. But right now, there is no fact one way or the other what colour was on that dinosaur's head, because there is no consensus on the matter within the paleontological community. Let's make this absolutely clear and contrast this to realism. Consider a scientific claim, for instance, the sun's energy is provided by thermonuclear fusion. Both the realist and the constructivist will assert this, they will assert P. Furthermore, both the realist and the constructivist will assert that P is true. Furthermore, they will both assert that P is true of the external world. It's a fact about the world, so P corresponds to the world, as in the correspondence theory of truth. Where they diverge is that the realist adds that P occurs independently of the mental. So the realist asserts the sun's energy is provided by thermonuclear fusion, and this occurs independently of the mental. On the other hand, the constructivist thinks that P is somehow dependent on our minds. So she asserts the sun's energy is provided by thermonuclear fusion, and this is dependent on the thoughts of the relevant scientific community, I suppose the community of astrophysicists. So as I said, constructivism is an extremely strange view, but just because something is extremely strange doesn't mean that it's wrong. So the question is, what are the arguments? Now, Turner in his discussion says that there are no successful arguments for constructivism. He does discuss a number of arguments for constructivism. It would be a bit of a tangent to go into those, so I'm just going to assume that Turner's judgment here is correct. We'll assume that there are no arguments for this extremely bizarre position. So that leads us to the realist. The question is, are there any successful arguments against social constructivism and in favour of realism? Are there any successful arguments that thermonuclear fusion in the sun is not dependent on our thoughts? There are two ways we might try to make such an argument. First, we might appeal to empirical evidence. We might try to forward an a posteriori argument. This approach is taken by realists who try to defend realism by the inference to the best explanation. We've already discussed this argument for realism in the video on the no miracles argument. This is the argument that claims that realism is the best explanation for the success of science. Now, whatever the virtues or flaws of this argument, Turner thinks that the inference to the best explanation is hopeless as a response to constructivism. Let's assume that the inference to the best explanation justifies belief in unobservables. So let's assume that we should believe in electrons because the best explanation of the success of scientific theories that postulate electrons is that such theories are true. Or, to use the example earlier, assume that the best explanation for the success of theories of stellar structure is that it is true that the sun's energy is provided by thermonuclear fusion, etc. The obvious problem here is that this isn't sufficient for realism, because both the realist and the constructivist agree with this. Again, here are the differences between realism and constructivism. Now, why should we think that that P1 provides a better explanation than P. First, note that P alone is the simpler explanation since it asserts fewer things. Second, notice that scientists themselves would tend to simply assert P. Scientists themselves tend to just assert claims about the world. They don't then go on to say that these things occur mind independently or anything like that. They'll say that the Black Death was caused by Yersinia pestis infection, not that the Black Death was caused by Yersinia pestis infection and this was mind independent. The obvious reason for this is that this is what can be supported by the evidence. Both the realists P1 and the constructivists P2 are needlessly inflationary. They both go beyond what the evidence allows us to conclude, and it's not clear, even in principle, what sort of evidence could decide between them. So Turner thinks that empirical considerations are simply irrelevant to the realist constructivist debate, because if we say want to give this, if we want to give an argument to the best explanation, like the standard realist argument, the most that you're going to get is just P. We will be justified in asserting P, but the realist wants to go further and say that this is independent of the mental, but that's just not supported by that argument. Now there is an obvious response here which Turner points out. Perhaps we could claim that P1 is implicitly asserted when we assert P. Our assertions have all sorts of implicit assumptions. Suppose you ask me where Frank has gone. I say he's gone to the beach. Now, an implicit assumption of the claim Frank is at the beach is that the beach is real, not fictional. I don't actually assert that the beach is not fictional, but clearly this is assumed in what I say. Similarly, the realist might suggest that there's not really any difference between P and P1, because when I say that the sun's energy is provided by thermonuclear fusion, I implicitly assume that this is mind independent, and the same is true for various other claims about the world. However, as Turner points out, this response just misses the point. The important question, surely, is not whether people implicitly assume mind independence, it's whether such an assumption is justified. And it's probably true that the mind independence of phenomena in the sun is implicitly assumed in claims about the sun. Most people tend to be realists, at least in my experience, but we can still ask whether this is justified. In the past, when people made claims about the sun, they would have implicitly assumed that the Earth is the fixed centre of the universe about which the sun revolves. That turned out to be false. So there's not really much use appealing to implicit assumptions. Ultimately, then, Turner thinks that the a posteriori argument for realism fails. Next, Turner considers whether there are any a priori arguments for realism. These arguments attempt to show that there is some sort of logical contradiction in constructivism, so the constructivist hypothesis can be ruled out even in the absence of any evidence. Perhaps the most incisive criticism of constructivism has come from Andrei Kukla, who suggests that constructivism leads to temporal incoherence. So what does the constructivist say about scientific change? Well, suppose that at time t1, scientists construct the fact that dinosaurs were cold-blooded at an earlier time to. Later, at time t2, scientists construct the fact that dinosaurs were warm-blooded at to. Now this looks like a straightforward contradiction. The constructivist seems to be committed to saying that it's a fact that, at to, dinosaurs were both cold-blooded and not cold-blooded. Hence, constructivism is incoherent. However, the constructivist has a rather simple response to this. Kukla's argument depends on the assumption that if something is a fact at a certain time, then it will continue to be a fact forever. So since it's a fact at T1 that dinosaurs were cold-blooded at TO, this must also be a fact at T2. But the constructivist can simply say that facts about the past change as scientists change their views. At T1, it is a fact that at TO dinosaurs were cold-blooded. At T2, it is a fact that at TO dinosaurs were not cold-blooded. Then presumably there is a transitionary period where the scientists engaged in debate where neither is a fact. So there are not two contradictory facts at T2, instead the facts about the past have changed. Now undoubtedly this is crazy. even repugnant. It doesn't seem even remotely plausible. But as we noted, the mere fact that something is crazy is not an argument against it. Kukla does have a further argument, though, that appeals to the transitivity of the past. The transitivity of the past is the fairly obvious idea that if x is in the past relative to y, and y is in the past relative to z, then x is in the past relative to z. So let's say that the world at T1 has a past that contains cold-blooded dinosaurs. The world at T2, which is a later time, has a past that does not contain cold-blooded dinosaurs. But notice that we now have the following claims, which form an argument here. Premise 1, the fact that dinosaurs were cold-blooded is in the past relative to T1. T1 is in the past relative to T2. So, given the transitivity of pastness, we must conclude that the fact that dinosaurs were cold-blooded is in the past relative to T2. And this means that relative to T2, the constructivist is forced to say that it's a fact that dinosaurs both were and were not cold-blooded in the past. Saying that facts about the past can change, this does not resolve the incoherence. So Turner objects that this argument equivocates on the phrase in the past relative to. There are two different interpretations of the conclusion of Kukla's argument here. In one interpretation, the constructivist would say the conclusion is true. The constructivist would say that at T2, it was a fact. At T2, it was a fact that dinosaurs were cold-blooded, but this is no longer a fact. This ceased to be a fact when the scientific consensus changed. 40 years ago, say, it was a fact that during the Jurassic era, dinosaurs were cold-blooded. Today, it is no longer a fact that during the Jurassic era, dinosaurs were cold-blooded. So we can say that the fact that dinosaurs were cold-blooded is indeed in the past relative to us. At an earlier time, it was a fact that dinosaurs were cold-blooded during the Jurassic. This is no longer a fact. Obviously, this is no problem for constructivism if they're prepared to accept that facts about the past change. However, in another interpretation, the fact that dinosaurs were cold-blooded is not in the past relative to us, and this is because at this time it's not a fact at all. It's no longer a fact that during the Jurassic dinosaurs were cold-blooded. Since this is no longer a fact, it can't be in the past relative to anything. So in this sense, the constructivist would deny the transitivity of the past. At T1, it's a fact that in the past dinosaurs were cold-blooded, but then this ceases to be a fact. So transitivity fails under this interpretation. So to put this clearly, the fact that Kukla's conclusion is that the fact that dinosaurs were cold-blooded is in the past relative to T2. Now, in one sense, the constructivist would say this is true because it was once a fact but is no longer. The fact that dinosaurs were cold-blooded is in the past in that sense. In another sense, it's no longer a fact. It's not a fact about the past that dinosaurs were cold-blooded. All we can say is that this was a fact about the past, but this fact changed when the scientific consensus changed. We have to be very careful interpreting constructivist claims about the past, but ultimately Turner thinks that Kukla fails to show that constructivism is incoherent. He does show that constructivism is very weird, but if somebody is prepared to bite the bullet and say that facts about the past can change, then none of Kukla's arguments should move them. Now, there are a couple of other a priori arguments against constructivism that Turner doesn't consider, but that are maybe worth mentioning. First, there is the charge that social constructivism is deeply morally repugnant. The constructivist has to say, for instance, that whether or not the Holocaust occurred is dependent on our beliefs. If historians came to the consensus that the Holocaust did not occur, but that instead the Holocaust was a big conspiracy invented by Jews who control the world, then it would become a fact that the Holocaust was indeed a conspiracy invented by Jews who control the world. And that's a very disturbing conclusion. That's a very deeply unsettling conclusion. The constructivist seems to be forced to say that we could choose to make anti-Semitic propaganda become a fact. And for many people, that will be reason enough to reject constructivism, because, of course, we want to say know that the Holocaust did happen, it's not a Jewish conspiracy, and that isn't dependent on us. The only point I would make here is, even if this moral argument provides a good reason to reject constructivism, or at least to resist constructivism, it doesn't actually show us that constructivism is wrong. It shows us that, it would show us that if constructivism is true, then the world doesn't work in the way we would like. But if that's the case, so be it, I would say. A second problem, which I think is rather more serious, is we might worry that constructivism is self-refuting. The vast majority of scientists are not constructivists. I suspect that the consensus among scientists would basically be realism. They assume that the phenomena they are studying are mind-independent. I might be wrong about this. We have to do some sociological studies to establish this, but I suspect that most scientists are realists. I mean, there have been a few non-realist tendencies in science, particularly among physicists during the early 20th century, but even they tended to be more like instrumentalists or logical positivists rather than constructivists. Anyway, if it's true that most scientists are realists, then we can point out that if we accept constructivism, then we think that facts are determined by scientific consensus. But then if the scientific consensus is that constructivism is false, because the objects of science are mind-independent, if the scientific consensus is that phenomena like thermonuclear fusion in the sun are mind-independent, well then, if we accept constructivism, it's a fact that constructivism is false. So the position seems self-refuting. Anyway, let's assume that Turner is right and that the a priori arguments against constructivism fail. So what's the point of all of this? Well, here we come to the crucial argument. Turner suggests that with respect to claims about the mind dependence or mind independence of scientific facts, we have no reason to believe one view or the other. So to lay it out more formally, Turner's argument is this. Premise 1, there are no convincing a priori or a posteriori arguments in favour of constructivism. Premise 2, there are no convincing a priori or a posteriori arguments against constructivism. So as we saw, we can't refute the constructivist by appealing to empirical claims, nor can we show that constructivism is logically contradictory. Conclusion number 1, no argument settles the question of whether objects postulated by science are mind-independent or mind-dependent. So the main conclusion is we should be agnostic about whether the scientific facts are mind-independent or mind-dependent. And actually, precisely the same argument could be run for everyday facts. I mean, it's not just limited to science. So where does this leave us? Well, remember the difference between realism and constructivism. We have a claim like the sun's energy is provided by thermonuclear fusion. We all agree with this. We all think that this is true. We all think that this is a fact about the world. But the realist wants to extend this claim by saying the sun's energy is provided by thermonuclear fusion, and this occurs independently of the mental. The constructivist extends it differently. She says the sun's energy is provided by thermonuclear fusion, and this is dependent on certain people's thoughts. Well, now we come to a way of understanding the natural ontological attitude. The natural ontological attitude tells us to be agnostic about the realist-constructivist debate. We simply accept the original claim. We simply accept P alone, and we don't make any further metaphysical claims. So the natural ontological attitude is a challenge because it encompasses so much of the realist position, but it is more minimal than realism. Even if we accept that scientific theories are true, and even if we accept that scientific theories are true in that they correspond to the world, so we accept that unobservables exist and that science gives us knowledge of the world, and so on, even if we accept all of this, we're not committed to realism. Realism makes a stronger claim. Realism is fundamentally a metaphysical view, and it goes beyond what the evidence can even in principle support. The natural ontological attitude is what Turner calls a don't know, don't care stance towards such metaphysical issues. In this sense, perhaps it is a plausible compromise between realism and anti-realism. We should trust science, we should believe that science gets at the truth, but whether that truth is discovered in a mind-independent world or constructed by us, will always be an entirely open question. So I don't think that the natural ontological attitude represents a core position that both realists and anti-realists accept. I think it's straightforwardly inconsistent with most forms of anti-realism, but I do think it represents a core position between realism and social constructivism, and in that respect it perhaps does present a big challenge to the realist. So that is it. That is all I wanted to talk about today, and I think that's probably the end of this series as a whole. Hope you found it interesting. Goodbye.